Thanks so much, Ed, for being willing to give us your time and share more about life in Madagascar and especially around strengthening capacity and surgical training. Um, if you haven't met Ted before, I think you're from Nottingham, did colorectal surgery, and then been serving in Madagascar for quite a few years with your family. So I'll hand over to you, and maybe you could just give us a bit of orientation about what you're planning to do, and tell us about the Slido as well and how we can use that. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's nice to be able to have the opportunity to get to know you a little bit before we start. And in fact, it's only Sarah who I haven't actually spoken to, but I know from, and I can't remember exactly from where we've met, but where is it,
Oh, I'm
Sarah?
glad you remember. I'm glad you remember me. Yeah, we were at maybe a couple of days on the developing health course. I did
Ah,
it in like, oh, it could have been a really long time ago.
yes.
2013 maybe.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I remember
I'm
that.
doing ENT
It was a
ENT
fun
training
time.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that from the group, the WhatsApp group that you're now doing ENT
Oh
training
yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so well, I'm just to before I start by saying what we're going to do, just to briefly continue the introduction of myself that Dave has started. So I'm Ted. I'm married to Rachel, and we've got two boys, Ethan and Jamie, who are now 10 and 7. So they're a bit younger in this photo. Um, and I trained in the UK in colorectal surgery. Rachel trained in pediatrics. And in 2017, we left the UK for initially France for 6 months of French language study, and then on to Madagascar, where we've been serving since then in this mission hospital, which I'm going to tell you a bit more about in a moment. So I guess, to finish off the introduction, I'm not a guru on how to do, um, anything to do with mission really, but also kind of strengthening systems or investing in people. It is what we're trying to do. So I hope that in some way I can share some of the lessons that we've learned along the way and that can be helpful for you. I really hope that we can be interactive. So we're a small group, which means we can chat. There's nothing to be worried about. We're all friendly. Although I know that perhaps you're not all in a place where it's easy for you to talk. So I understand that. But do post questions on the Zoom chat if you want to, or interact in other ways. You can raise a hand or just start talking if you want to. But yes, I really want it to be useful for you guys, and so if you can help me to shape it to be more useful for you, then do. So what I thought that we would do as we go through the session is talk a bit about our ministry in Madagascar, and really just what we've been doing here over the last 7 years, and how we're trying to invest in individuals to try and strengthen the healthcare system more broadly in Madagascar. I hope you'll forgive me for I've put in a section on finding your life calling, and that is, I think, because when I was at the stage of investigating what to do in terms of mission and involvement in that kind of thing, I think I might have found some of that stuff quite useful to think about, talk about. So it's not completely the topic that I was given, but I think it might be helpful. So hopefully we can have a bit of a chat about that. Then we're going to look at a case scenario. We're going to think more concretely about investing in people along the way. Now, I'd put in this Slido, which is basically to find out what is your background, but I think I now know what each of your background is. So I don't think we need to do that. And then there is another one here, which is on, if I can get it to move across. There you go. What is your interest in global health or missions? And again, it might just be easier if you feel able to just kind of say, like, what is your long-term hope or even short-term hope? Or if you prefer, then you can put it on this Slido. But do feel free just to unmute and say something if that's easier for you. I've not used Slido before, but I think it's quite straightforward to use if you just kind of look at it with your camera phone. When I was first in Madagascar, which was in like 2004, there was a guy here called David Mann, who's a wonderful, godly Christian man, but completely out of touch in terms of technology. And he was going through airport security once, and they said to him, "Have you got an iPad?" And he was like, What do you mean?" It's like putting his hand up to his eye. "What, my eyes are fine. Like, why would I need a patch for my eye?" And so I thought I don't think I'll ever become like him, but now I'm like, I don't really know how all these things work. So maybe I'm becoming more like him than I thought I would. So I don't know if people have managed to reply or if it's easier just to say, you just say, but
I'm on Zoom on my phone, so I'm not sure I can manage both at once. So I'll just briefly say, I feel a burden of how important global surgery is, but I feel deeply inadequate. And my experience of worked in South Africa for years and F3, just felt very anxious all the time and out of my depth. So would love, I suppose I pray and I feel connected, and I've got various people whose prayer letters I get, things like that. And I just still don't know how it could work for me to serve. Maybe it will be a short-term thing. Like, I have got this connection with the hospital in Nepal that I've just visited twice for 2 weeks each time. And maybe that's what I'll do, just kind of keep involved with that. But I mean, I'm available to go. I just don't know how it would be possible.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear. And I mean, in a way, it's good to have the insights that you feel out of your depth, because having worked in a place like Mandritsara, where we get lots of visitors, lots of people coming short term, long term, we get a lot of relatively junior doctors from the UK who generally feel quite out of their depth. We occasionally get people who really ought to feel more out of their depth than they apparently do. So I think it's probably better to be in the category of feeling out of your depth and being a bit cautious about what you take on. And yeah. Okay, well, that's really helpful to see. And hopefully, basically this idea that you're interested in potential involvement in global health in the future through kind of mission or other global health work, then that's really helpful to see. That's kind of what I'm hoping to talk about. So that's encouragement for me, at least. Okay, so this is the place that we work in. It's called Hopitali Vauvau Mafali, which means the hospital of the news that makes you happy. So it's an evangelical mission hospital that takes the opportunity to provide much needed healthcare in a region that is very much lacking that, but also to share the good news of Jesus with the patients. Our hospital is in this place called Mandritsara. Literally, the meaning of Mandritsara is sleep well. So it's a kind of sleepy place at the end of the road, north from Antananarivo, which is the capital. So it's a 24-hour drive north. I mean, yeah, so it's variable, but it's about that sort of length. Although we also are served by Mission Aviation Fellowship, so we can fly kind of an hour and a half's flight in a light aircraft to get here as well. Madagascar is, essentially a large part of Madagascar is in what you would call extreme poverty. Globally, between 1990 and 2015, extreme poverty went down. One of the Millennium Development Goals went down from 47% to 14%. But in Madagascar, over that same time, extreme poverty went up from 67% to around 80%. And I guess the question is, what does extreme poverty mean? What does it really look like for people to be living in extreme poverty? A couple of the things, or to highlight a few of the things that means, one of the things we see a lot of is undernutrition. So just taking a step back from malnutrition to undernutrition, 33% of the population are undernourished. That looks like 50% of the children being stunted, so very short stature, with a lot of implications for the rest of health, brain development, all those things that come with stunting. There's a Malagasy proverb, which is that we look for the food for today. And one of my one of my surgical residents, told me that in his experience when he was growing up, it was more, we look for the food for today, tomorrow. So there's a lot of food insecurity, people really living day to day in terms of their nutrition. In terms of education, Madagascar's got the world's 5th highest number of out-of-school children. So one of the things I do is vesicovaginal fistula repair, and as part of the funding for that, I have to do surveys of all the women who've had vesicovaginal fistula repair, and that includes asking them questions about education and schooling. And it's very common for me to meet a 15, 16-year-old girl who's got a vesicovaginal fistula, who has done maybe 1 or 2 years of schooling as a child, doesn't know how to read, and then obviously all the implications of that for her and for society, of someone who's not in a great position to stand up for herself, to make autonomous decisions and all those things, because she's been let down by the education system. In terms of infrastructure, basically very poor infrastructure. Outside of the capital, very few people have access to electricity. In terms of the whole population, it's 13% of the population that have access to electricity, and only 2% have got access to sanitation, so clean water and places to get rid of the dirty stuff. And when I talk about Madagascar, what I'll often say about Mandritsara is we are in a remote, rural and resource poor setting. So I've talked about how Madagascar itself is a very poor country in lots of different ways. But what does it mean? What does that look like in Mandritsara, which is a remote place within Madagascar? So we serve an area which is 90% subsistence rice farmers, and they are coming from up to 5 days walk to reach the hospital. So crossing rivers, lots of, in the rainy season, very muddy, unkept paths to get to the hospital, whilst potentially in labor or suffering from appendicitis or whatever it might be. So very remote. For most people, there's no access to other hospitals. Well, so there are some other like what we would call kind of medical centers or something like that, but not surgical hospitals with laboratories, blood transfusion, X-ray, all that kind of thing. Because the nearest big city with hospital facilities is about a 17-hour drive away, and if you don't have access to cars or to payment for going on public transport, then that's obviously not accessible. I said it's very rural. 90% of the population of subsistence rice farmers. This is using kind of ancient farming techniques. It's cattle pulling kind of wooden carts. Rice is a very fickle crop. It's very reliant on good amounts of rain, just the right amount of rain at the right time in order to get the best yield. So yeah, it doesn't feel like the best crop to really be growing here, where we don't have a reliable rainy season. It's very, very changeable. And then, yeah, resource poor. That obviously means no money, but it really means that when they face catastrophe or challenges in life, then that can be really impoverishing. So, for example, a relative needing an operation can have a really significant impact on people in this area. So that's just a picture of these ancient farming techniques. So no mechanized farming, it's all hand sowing, harvesting. It looks absolutely backbreaking what people are doing. And another picture of just the kind of the surrounding countryside around us. And so in this beautiful country, which I think is beautiful, it's a really striking place to live. There's lots of cultural, ecological diversity, but there's also significant spiritual darkness. So the region is animist, which basically means a belief in spiritual beings or forces that influence everyday life. This tree, which is about 2 or 3 minutes walk from the hospital, has got 2 altars at the bottom of it. I don't know if you can see them on the left-hand side there as we look at it. Those 2 white sheets around those stones. So these are altars that are actively used. You'll see people offering meat, grain, berries, these kinds of things on the altars, often related to their trip to and from market, which is kind of, this is a road coming into the Mandritsara town where they could go to the market. So animism is not historical in this area. It's very much alive and well. It's quite enslaving. It's difficult to be the only person in your village who's not following these kinds of practices. And often it involves some very, very strongly held beliefs that are really difficult to counter. Not least about the spiritual realm, but also about physical, real sort of, tangible things like it's forbidden for me to have more than 1 operation. So someone who won't go back to theatre because it's been determined that that is taboo for them, for example. That's just a more close-up view of those altars. You can see some meat there on the altars there. So into this kind of context, 27 or so years ago, this mission hospital was planted. So the original missionaries, together with the Bible Baptist Church of Madagascar, went to the government and said, we'd like to start a mission hospital. Where would you like us to put it? And they said, Mandritsara. And so that's why we're here. And this was the original clinic of Vava Mafali, which is just built right next to the airstrip. And then over the last 25 or so years, the hospital has grown up from that little clinic. It's moved slightly outside of town now to a bigger site. It's now a hospital of 60 or so beds, got 4 operating theatres. We do about 1,800 operations a year. And we're meeting a significant proportion of the medical and surgical needs of the population for this district and for a larger area for certain sort of tertiary referral needs. As I mentioned before, we're the only one offering surgical services for a long distance, the only hospital offering x-rays and blood. Yeah, we're here to help meet the significant physical need that we see in the population. But we're also here to help meet that spiritual need, which is obviously universal around the world, but also very apparent here. So all the staff who work in the hospital are Christians, professing Christians, and we have the opportunity to share the good news of Jesus with our patients through praying with them, through morning gospel talks on each of the wards and in outpatients, and through giving out tracts and things like that. Sorry, I just need a quick. And yeah, and remarkably, we've seen you know, a really great amount of fruit from that over the last 25 years through the work of the hospital, through our partnership with a local church, and through the work of the community health team that we send out from the hospital into the surrounding villages. We've seen around 60 churches planted in the region over the last quarter of a century. And so whilst it's a sort of dark area spiritually with this very active animism, it also appears to be a really open door. You know, it has happened that whole villages have decided to turn their back on these animistic spiritual practices, and there's been burning of all the kind of related paraphernalia for a village, as they've sort of declared that they are turning their back on it and turning to the true God. And so it's incredible to see God working through the hospital in these ways. And I think a real testimony to the power of medical mission, that it's, you know, sometimes we hear it said that medical mission has had its day, or, you know, something like that, but there are definitely still places in the world where the provision of medical care can provide a wonderful opportunity to share the good news of Jesus, and it can have a real impact by God's grace in the community. So this is just a picture of one of the morning talks. One of our previous missionaries, Nathan, there sharing the gospel with these patients who are waiting for their outpatient appointment. The hospital also has a radio station which broadcasts to the area, Christian radio programs, and we have a school which is basically there to help facilitate staff living and working in this region so they can educate their children. And as I mentioned, community health work. We've also got a program for doing theological education for village church pastors. So with these large numbers of small church plants arising in the region, the need for training the pastors obviously became apparent. And so there's actually a 7-year program of theological education that we do 2 months a year over 7 years. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about what does surgery look like in Mandritsara. I guess the key things to say are, you know, it includes every surgical speciality. So there are now 3 of us surgical attendings in the hospital. We do divide up a little bit what we do between us, just because we've got different interests, but essentially we're all handling, you know, whatever comes through the door. There's a lot of delayed presentations because of the fact that people are walking a long way. People are often hoping that the problems will go away because that's a lot cheaper than coming to the doctor. And so they come when it's clear that things aren't going to get better. Things are complicated a lot by malnutrition. So, you know, doing a laparotomy on someone who's got a background of malnutrition and then has not eaten for 10 days because they've been delayed in their presentation really affects outcomes. We don't have any referral options. So very occasionally we will have the option to refer a patient to some sort of camp, whether that might be pediatric cardiac camp or something like that. But other than that, there's really no option to refer people anywhere else, which in a sense is actually really quite liberating in the sense you're not faced constantly with the dilemma of, do we think the care that they will receive elsewhere might be better than what we're offering here? But knowing that what we're doing here is the best option, it's their only option, helps us to kind of say, okay, well, you know, within sensible boundaries, we will do what we can for this person. Obviously, no advanced imaging. We've got ultrasound, we've got X-rays. We don't have things like CT scans, and quite limited blood availability. So we occasionally give people 4 units of blood in a trauma situation or something like that. But you're only able to deliver 1 unit of blood every 45 minutes or so. So it's really not massive transfusion in that sense. And also, I think it's just fair to say we have to deal with our own skill and experience limitations. So we're all doing our best in the situation we're in with the skills and experience that we've got. But there are limitations to that. And so, you know, sometimes the reason why things don't go great is because there aren't the resources. Sometimes it's because of patient factors. Sometimes it's to do with the beliefs of the patient and their family, but sometimes it's just down to us not knowing what to do, which is sometimes quite hard to deal with. And often we're practicing within an environment where there's an absence of evidence. So we love to practice evidence-based medicine. That's obviously the way forward, but sometimes there just isn't the evidence for our scenario. How to manage something without certain resources, or how to manage certain diseases that are very common here but aren't seen very commonly elsewhere. So just to talk then about the kind of the surgical development of the surgical service in Mandritsara. So when we arrived in Mandritsara in 2017, well, I'll just go back very slightly. So I first came to Mandritsara in 2007. I was doing my medical student elective, and I was here for 7 weeks. And I was really struck by the fact that this was medical mission being done really well. There was a huge need, particularly identified at that time, for surgery, although undeniably there's need not just for surgery, but for all sorts of different specialities. That excited me, but also there was this huge spiritual need and this opportunity to meet it, a really open door to share the gospel with people. And so a couple of years after that, so I got married to Rachel. And then a couple of years after that, the two of us came back to Mandritsara for a year as a kind of tasting, let's see, is this the sort of place that God might be calling us to? And if so, what might we need to do to get prepared to go? And after that, we felt this was where God was calling us. So I went back to do more surgical training, and Rachel went back to do more pediatric training. And then we started our family. And then back in 2017, we came here long term. When I first arrived on the surgical side, I was the only surgeon. There were a couple of GP surgeons when I first arrived who, within the first 18 months, had left. And I had a Malagasy junior doctor called Tefi, who I'd kind of adopted and started showing a few things. But we didn't have another surgical colleague. And I just immediately, well, obviously you realize that, well, what are we going to do when I want to go on holiday or on home assignment for 4 months, or even begin to imagine what would happen if, you know, if we had to leave, and, you know, literally the day we left was the last opportunity to have a cesarean, or to, you know, it just felt very unsustainable. And also at that time, we had 2 young kids, and there were no other kids on our mission compound, Malagasy or missionary. Felt quite isolated for them. And so we were a bit concerned about what we would do. Little did we know that what was around the corner was COVID and even more isolation and all of that. But at the time, we were concerned by the situation we were facing. And so, yeah, we began to think, well, okay, if we're going to try and get more surgeons for Madagascar, for our hospital in Mandritsara, how are we going to do that? Obviously, getting missionaries feels great, but there's a great fragility to the supplying surgeons through missionaries, because at some point people might it might coincide that everyone leaves at the same time. And so we started to look at what it might be like to try and recruit someone from Madagascar. And we came across this paper that was quite helpfully published by people who were working with mercy ships in Madagascar in 2016, which was looking at surgical preparedness in Madagascar. And they did a survey to count the number of surgeons, anesthetists, and obstetricians, gynecologists in the country. And so for a population of 27 million people, they discovered that there were 94 surgeons, which is definitely not enough surgeons. As we kind of began to think about, well, so what is the likelihood, humanly speaking, that we'll find one of those surgeons wants to come and serve in this hospital in the middle of nowhere, is a committed evangelical Christian, etc., etc. So it identified, this paper, a serious issue across the whole island in terms of the provision of surgical care, but it also just highlighted to us the kind of unlikeliness, humanly speaking, that we would be able to meet the need for surgeons in our hospitals simply from the kind of population of Malagasy surgeons that was already out there. Just to continue a little bit about what that paper demonstrated, I think many of you might be familiar with the Lancet Commission on Global Surgery, that basically kind of really first time properly articulated what is the situation in terms of global surgery, and identified that what had previously been thought that there's about 2 billion people on the planet who don't have access to surgery, that actually when you define proper access as access within 2 hours to safe and affordable surgery, there's actually 5 billion people on the planet, more than half the planet, that doesn't have access to that kind of surgery. So that 2-hour access idea, as well as the affordability idea, were picked up on by this paper looking at the situation in Madagascar. And they said that they demonstrated that only 29% of the population had access to timely surgery within 2 hours. And that in terms of affordability, if you needed an operation in Madagascar, you have a very high, greater than 80% chance of incurring impoverishing expenditure, and even perhaps a slightly higher chance of incurring catastrophic expenditure. So the access within 2 hours to safe, affordable surgery in Madagascar is very low. So taking into account then that big need that we were facing in our own hospital, and then the big needs that we were seeing across the island for surgical care, we began to think, could it be possible that we train surgeons here in Mandritsara? And I had come across an organization called PAX, which is the Pan-African Academy of Christian Surgeons. I'd heard about them, I'd come across their website. When you look at their website, they say the criteria that you need in order to start a PAX site is to have 3 American board certified surgeons. And at the time I was one, and I obviously wasn't American board certified, so I didn't really know whether they would count British qualifications or not. But I was basically a bit put off the idea, simply because it didn't seem very feasible. The first step is you need to get 2 more surgeons. That's exactly our problem, is that we can't get other surgeons. But nonetheless, and I can't really remember exactly why, I was encouraged to go and sit the exam with the College of Surgeons of East Central and Southern Africa, which is the equivalent of our exam in the UK, like the Fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons. It's the qualification that the PAX training prepares people for, and it would be therefore a necessity for me, if I wanted to be a PAX trainer, to have got that qualification, but also a useful exercise in terms of understanding what it is we're trying to prepare people for. So I went to do that exam. It was about 6 years after I'd done my own fellowship exam. So it was a real pain, because I had actually forgotten everything and had to revise from, not quite from scratch, but, had to revise for this exam again. And it was in Rwanda. And I remember we were on our way back to the UK when I went to go and sit the exam. And we must have had, like, I don't know, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old or something. We were in Ethiopian transit lounge in Addis Ababa at about 2 o'clock in the morning with some, frustrated and screaming kids. And I was about to go and get my flight to Rwanda and leave these kids with my wife, who had to keep them going throughout the night and get them onto the plane back to England in the morning. And it felt like, well, what is it that we're doing when this all seems like, just making life hard, completely pointless. We haven't got 3 surgeons. It's just, I'm just making life difficult for my family. But when I went to Rwanda, I, thank God, managed to pass the exam. It would have been extremely embarrassing to have failed it. But also, I met a couple of different people. I met a Canadian surgeon called Jesh Thiessen, who was currently working in Burundi, but was also kind of interested in where he might end up going long term. And I also met a Malagasy surgeon called Marco, who at the time was not at all interested in coming to work in Mandritsara, but was a nice guy to chat to, and we got on well. And actually, about 6 months after I left Rwanda, I just got a message one day from Jesh saying, "Are you still looking for another surgeon?" To which I replied, yes. And then when Marco heard that there were both Jesh and Ted in Mandritsara wanting to start PAX, and we just needed one more person, suddenly he got interested, and he came and joined us as well. We realized that in order to start the PAX program, we needed better infrastructure. It's in fact one of the requirements of PAX. There are various infrastructure requirements in terms of needing, for example, a recovery ward, some sort of dedicated intensive care, although that doesn't mean the same, obviously, as it does in the West. So we started building a building project to build the new operating theatres with a recovery high dependency unit and some training rooms, kind of conference rooms for doing surgical training, etc. This was right at the beginning of 2020. And just as we were beginning to break the ground for this building project, all the kind of borders closed. Madagascar was pretty quick to say, we're an island, we can isolate, just close everything, don't let anyone in or out. And we thought this was going to mean that all this was put on hold. But actually, there was a team of men who were in Mandritsara doing a building project for the government. When COVID hit, the government immediately cancelled that building project, but also stopped everyone moving between towns. And so these guys were just stuck in Mandritsara with nothing to do. And so we were able to say, well, come and build our surgical block. And so they came, and we found this team of 20 men who came and did the construction for the surgical block. So it's all work done by hand using bricks built in the bricks fired in the fields around the hospital, and not much health and safety in the building techniques. But at the beginning of 2022, we were able to open this new building, complete with 4 operating theatres, a recovery, a high dependency unit, and some other facilities. But the point of all of that, obviously, was not just to build a nice building, but to be able to do surgical training. Excuse me. We had managed to get PAX to agree to let us run a program, which they did during COVID without visiting the hospital, which was the first time they'd agreed to a program without visiting the hospital. In the back row there, you've got Marco, Jesh, and myself, the kind of attendings, all very American. And then in the front row, those are our residents. So if you can think of residents are basically like registrars, but far more tired. That seems to be my the working patterns that the Americans put their residents through are a bit brutal. So yeah, in January 2022, we started this 5-year surgical training program aimed at training Malagasy junior doctors to be surgeons, but also discipling them to be people who love Jesus and love to make him known to others, and who want to use the opportunities that they get through healthcare to make Jesus known. So they both sit exams through PAX, but they also sit this COSEXA exam. So now we're in our 3rd year of that program. So some of our more senior residents are approaching their equivalent of MCS membership exams, and then in a couple of years after that, they'll do their fellowship exams, God willing. It's a great opportunity to really pour into the lives of these young men, and God willing, hopefully women soon. We're hoping to appoint our first woman trainee in the next batch. because we're such a small program, we've got 3 attendings and 4 residents at the moment. It's really a very personal training. We try to avoid calling it like kind of an apprenticeship, because we're trying to make sure that it's got a proper academic basis and that they're learning academic surgery rather than just how to do things. So we want them to not only be in a position to operate themselves, but in a position to train another generation beyond them. We do surgical conferences a couple of afternoons a week, and we also do yearly in-service exams. So they're constantly being put through their paces, made to learn stuff. And we have a weekly PAX Bible study with residents and their spouses, which is a really wonderful time of growing together as a group as we study God's word together, and sometimes do prayer and praise and those kind of things together as well. Okay, we can pause for a second. I don't know if there's any questions at that point before we move on to the next section. Yeah, do either just raise a hand, or I don't know if someone's already written something in the chat, but I can't see that. But
there was a question in the chat.
Oh.
Go ahead, Sarah, I think you had that.
Well, no. I was just going to ask, does PAX tell you what to do? Like, do you have a program kind of laid out, or have you had to invent it from scratch?
So PAX have no, they don't really tell you what to do, as in they say, this is the textbook that we are going to examine you on. So, teach them that. Yeah, it's not like there's and so then we then design our own teaching programs and how to prepare the residents for exams. Particularly for us, our residents are Francophone. Madagascar is an ex-French colony. And that it's hard to say this without it sounding odd, but essentially that really impacts the whole way you think, and your whole educational background is very much more rote learning that they're used to. They're used to the role of the teacher being to be the source of information rather than the one who is kind of pointing you to the information and helping you to seek that information yourself. And so they struggle with the idea of analyzing, critical thinking about a topic, for example, because that's just not the way that they've been taught. So preparing them for that kind of stuff is an additional challenge. They've never done multiple choice questions before. So, their exams are normally very broad essay type questions. And suddenly they're being asked quite specific multiple choice questions. Is a big change for them. So we have to do lots of adapting to all of that kind of stuff. Dave, did you say there was a question in the?
Just a quick one. Does Sara mean Mandarin? Sara, does Sara mean sleep or well?
Yeah, Mandarin means to lie down or to sleep, and Sara means well or good.
Oh, I'm sure Sara will be pleased with that. Yeah.
Means good, yeah. It doesn't...
I don't know. I identify with the sleep as well.
It's with the T, unfortunately. So it's Sara rather than just Sara.
Great. And I think Jodie's got a hand up there as well.
Yeah, go.
Thanks. I just wondered, obviously you've got all the surgeons. How did you get anaesthetics involved?
Yeah, so when I first arrived, we as surgeons were doing our own anaesthetics. And in the last few years, we've brought in nurse anaesthetists. So yeah, it's an interesting thing, really. The nurse anaesthetics, they might come out of their nurse anaesthetic training having done maybe 10 spinal anaesthetics and probably no general anaesthetics. So we kind of talk about them, not wanting to be dismissive, but basically these are people who arrive ready to be trained to be an anaesthetist rather than people who arrive trained to be an anaesthetist. They train a large number of them, so most of these people are not working. They've finished their training and they're not in employment as an anaesthetist. And so then we're recruiting people who've both been trained but then not really got any experience after training, because there isn't the work for them, because there aren't the surgeons doing the operating for them to work for. And so we've had we had a guy from Cambridge called Joel Chin, consultant anaesthetist there, who came out for a year and did a lot of training with our current crop of nurse anaesthetists, which made a fantastic difference. He's a pediatric anaesthetist, so it really helped them with confidence in what are often the cases that really are scary for people who are not pediatricians, which the neonatal anesthetics, etc. So that's been really helpful. But yes, it's still they are, I would say, a little bit more technicians than they are clinicians. So they can do the spinal, they can intubate the patient, but the decision making that comes around it is really still medically led.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, well, so let's move on to talk about this subject of finding your life calling. And I read this book called What's Best Next, which is by a guy who used to work in Desiring God Ministries, John Piper's ministry in the States, and really helpful on kind of gospel-centered productivity, but actually starts with some stuff on like making sure that you're being productive in doing the right thing, and so kind of working out what it is that God wants you to be doing with your life, and I think has some really helpful things to say on that. And so this next little section is basically based on what this guy Matt Perman says in that in a couple of chapters in that book. But I recommend, if you're interested in it, to get that book and look more deeply into it. And I guess the question that maybe we sometimes ask ourselves is it right for Christians to be ambitious? Ambition doesn't sound like a particularly positive Christian virtue. And we might think that ambition feels kind of the contrary or the opposite of humility, as in, who are we to think so highly of ourselves that we would imagine that we could do such a thing? And really what Matt Perman is trying to say is, no, Christian ambition is right, but it needs to be truly Christian ambition. And so I guess that's what we're going to have a little look at now. He reminds us that Zechariah says, do not despise the day of small things. And yeah, sometimes people would say, okay, does that mean really that we shouldn't dream big goals? It's, the Christian life is lived in the everyday acts, all of which is true. But does that mean that it's wrong to dream big goals? And are they in some way inherently secular or prideful? There's an old preacher from kind of 1800 or so, called Charles Bridges, who was in the Church of England, who said, yes, do not despise the day of small things, but also do not be satisfied with it either. Aim high and you will come closer to reaching the mark. So his point is, yeah, that's right. The small things are important in life, and it's the everyday acts of kindness, the everyday choices to live for God that are what God wants from us. But it's also okay to think of the big things. And Matt Perman gives us the example of Paul's ambition. So Paul uses the word ambition to say, I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. But as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand. So the Apostle Paul had a specific, ambitious goal to preach the gospel where Christ wasn't known. And he viewed his life as a mission, an all-consuming task to do that, to bring the gospel to places where Jesus is not already known, for the sake of God's glory. So the question is, should we be ambitious as Christians? Yes, but not for self-glory. So it should look very different from worldly ambition. We shouldn't be focusing on feathering our own nests, but on serving others, and doing good in the world rather than seeking our own success. And it is right that we should not only dream big. If we live with our heads in the clouds, just thinking of what we will one day do, then we're not serving the people around us. We're not involved in acts of service day by day. Then that's not honoring to God or advancing his kingdom either. So we should be working to integrate that idea of having big goals with living for Christ in the everyday. So what is a life calling? According to this guy, Matt Perman, he says that a life calling or vision is a large overarching objective that governs one's actions and decisions. Now, I think the thing he wants to make clear is that you need to have something that is big, that is quite specific, and that can be completed. So it's not just, I want to live for God with my whole life, which is obviously a great ambition, but it's difficult to say whether or not you've done that. So it needs to be something that is a bit more specific. It might be, for example, reaching a certain demographic, or being involved in planting a church, or something like this that is a bit more definite. And I think he's not talking about life calling as in what you will do for the next 50 years of your life, for the whole of your life, but more, what is it that God wants you to be doing with your life now? So it's not I need to plan now or have a vision now for what I'm going to do for the next however many years that God gives me, but more, what is God's calling on my life now? And it's important to recognize that we might, discern what we think God wants us to do with our lives, and it might change. It often does change. I'd say probably for most people it changes. It's not like there are many people who know as a young person what they're going to do with their whole life. I had an email from a GP this week who was interested in coming to serve in Mandritsara, and he has been interested in mission all his life. And he told the story of how when he was young with his young wife, they went out to Africa. This is more than 30 years ago, intending to serve there long term. And then they had a child who had additional needs, and they felt compelled to return to the UK. And now, as they come up to retirement and their child is beginning to gain a bit more independence, they're thinking that actually maybe now they can reconsider coming to the mission field. And you don't want to say that someone like that has in some way, he identified his life calling, which was to be a missionary for the whole of his life in Africa, and then he didn't manage to do it. That's not what's going on there. This is someone who did identify what God wanted him to be doing with his life, what God wanted him to be doing with his life for that time when they were in Africa, but then responded to that higher calling, that godly calling of being a loving father and mother, obviously, to their child who needed them to be doing something else. So this isn't about identifying something that we will follow come what may, and if we don't, we've in some way failed. But it is about trying to be a bit purposeful about saying, what is it that we think God wants us to be doing with our lives? How does he want us to use our lives now? And I think that is a helpful thing for us to think, recognizing we're not lords of our lives. We don't get to choose all these things. But God does want us to be purposeful. And I think we've already seen this example of the Apostle Paul's life goal being to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Another good example is, William Wilberforce, who clearly articulated his kind of life calling to abolish the slave trade and to reform manners, the societal morals. We're not all going to be William Wilberforce. I mean, none of us are going to be William Wilberforce. But at the same time, I think we can learn something from that purposefulness, seeing a need, articulating it, and thinking, okay, what is it that I can do? What steps can I take today to move towards that need? So I don't know whether you feel able to kind of articulate, maybe you feel in some ways that you have already identified what you think God wants you to be doing with your life. Maybe you feel like you're in the process of doing that at the moment. Does anyone have any thoughts they want to share on how can we go about working out what is it that God wants us to be doing with our lives, with all the caveats that I've kind of mentioned there?
You didn't wait for a big booming voice from heaven, Ted.
No, not for me.
Okay. Was it, obviously I'm not medical, but I think it can still relate. Is it just something that you felt it was almost an instinct, and then you ran with it until push doors until they close, kind of thing? Is that, it's not very theological, but
yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that there's a lot in that. I remember one of my mentors when I was at university saying, often God guides you by what you like doing, what you love doing. Just keep on doing something, obviously it needs to be not sinful, and it needs to be in line with God's mission for the world. But it's, maybe just push the doors that you think that seems to be right. That seems to be what I'm enjoying doing. I think that's a helpful idea. Anyone else got any other thoughts?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I feel like my internet's been a bit glitchy.
We can.
Yes, similar to what you were saying about just then about what you enjoy doing. I found a quote quite helpful that resonates. And it says our calling is where the world's deep hunger and your the world's hunger and your deep gladness meet. So it's where's the world's deep need, and where do you find what gives you life? So what do you love doing? What makes you glad? And combining the two is where your calling is.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really helpful point, isn't it? Because it needs to be meeting a real need. Whatever you do, whether it's secular or Christian, if you're not meeting a need, then there's no point in doing it. And as Christians, even if it's a need for your own sake, it's got to do something. And so as Christians wanting to serve with our lives, I think that idea that you've got to find that cross section, or that place where what the world needs and what you can provide meet. That's a very helpful idea.
I think it's probably quite helpful to think about input from others. I think about Paul's calling in Acts to be sort of the apostle to the Gentiles. That was actually more of something that was discovered in the church in Antioch, and the Holy Spirit spoke to the church to set aside Paul and Barnabas for the work. And I think we can think quite individualistically as Westerners about these things, and I think input from friends and mentors and church leaders, sort of, what could I do? What do you think would be a good fit for me? They're perhaps good questions to ask kind of trusted friends and mentors as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, when we were at the point of kind of trying to think about, and to be honest, I mean, one of the things I do, because I'm involved with lots of volunteers coming to Mandrad Zara, and so I have lots of conversations with people at various stages of thinking about mission, and lots of people who are unsure still whether this is something they want to do. And I feel like we know about praying, and we know about reading God's word, and we know that God is going to guide us in those ways, but it's really important not to forget that God has also given us other people, and that is a key way in which he speaks into our lives, through, as you say, Dave, the advice of those who we know and trust, who know us, who know our strengths, but also our weaknesses, who know what we enjoy, who see when we're thriving and when we're struggling, and all those things. Now, for some of us, that might be people like parents, it might be home group leaders, it might be your minister, it might be just close friends. Really just trying to be serious about saying, look, you tell me, when you look at me, what do you think would be something that God might be calling me to? And they may find it quite easy to point out something that you're really struggling to see, just because they can take a step back and look at you in the whole. I put together just a few things here which I think are helpful. They kind of say really some of the things we've mentioned there. I think it is helpful, this question, what would you do if you had all the resources that you needed? So that's one of the questions from Matt Perman's book. So it's just imagining that you weren't constrained by something. What is it that you would like to do? So you might think, for example, as some people did 25 years ago, we'd really like to start a hospital in Madagascar, but you might have thought, well, but how are we going to do that? Because, it's going to cost so much money and all this sort of thing. But just thinking, well, what would you try to do if you weren't constrained by resources? What's the one thing that you would focus on if you could only do one thing in the next 3 years? That's another question from Matt Perman. And then I think, this, what do you enjoy? In what ways can you contribute? What gifts and abilities do you have? And does this align with God's mission? So we're always wanting to say, this isn't just what do we want to do with our lives, but does this fit with the biblical pattern of what God calls Christians to in general, how he wants Christians to live their lives? And I think we kind of the reality is that God is more concerned about who we are than where we are. Like he's more concerned about how we are acting in the world than whether we've decided to go to Madagascar or to England or to Papua New Guinea or wherever. But he does sometimes call us to go to those places, and so being kind of open to see that might be what God is doing. One of my old pastors put it to me like this, which is, what would it look like for me as the person that I am, with the gifts God has given me, to live my life intentionally for God and his glory? And just to intentionally ask ourselves that question. And kind of related to all this, what do you do if you just are struggling to work out your life calling? Well, just some of the things we already mentioned there: praying, reading God's word, believing that he speaks to us today through his word, seeking wise counsel, and then just kind of getting on with stuff. So taking action, committing, going places, rather than kind of hoping for things to happen to you. Go and do some things. Obviously seek inspiration, engage in opportunities to network, to meet other people who are doing similar things, got similar interests, to kind of dream dreams together, chat together, etc. Yeah, don't feel like you can't get fully involved in what you're doing today because you're not sure what God is calling you to. Just get stuck into what you're doing now. If that means you're a junior doctor in Nottingham, get stuck into your church, get stuck into serving your community, and don't kind of just be on pause waiting, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. This is a helpful quote from old Winston that I think I found a helpful thing to be reminded of, and certainly it's happened to me, this idea. So to every person there comes in their lifetime that special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to them and their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for the work that could have been their finest hour. And I mean, he uses very grand terms, but I found when I was getting ready to go to be a missionary in Mandritsara, there were lots of people in Mandritsara encouraging me to stop surgical training before I became a consultant, because you could just come here and just work, and you don't need a consultant qualification in Mandritsara to work as a surgeon, and we really need you to come. And for various reasons, and not really of my own doing, I ended up staying to finish training in the UK. And then this realization dawned on us once we were already in Madagascar that actually we needed to be training surgeons, and that required me to be not American board certified, fortunately, but the equivalent of American board certified. So I needed that consultant qualification. And it would have been very sad if I had got to within a couple of years of it and walked away because I thought, oh, I ought to already go. And then we would have not been able to do PAX training. So I kind of feel like what that's saying is, just prepare, get ready, do all the training you can, get all the life experience you can, because you never quite know what might be useful, what God might be doing through those experiences and training that you're getting, that's preparing you for a moment in the future when you're going to need them. Okay. So coming towards, we're not far off the end, but I wanted to share a little case study, which is of this little boy called C. We'll call him C just to preserve his anonymity, but he has, and his family have allowed us to share this photograph and his story. So he was referred to us in Mandritsara because he had urine leaking from his rectum. So he sat on a branch that went straight into his bum and into his rectum and into his bladder. And he had had 2 previous operations in the capital, which had left him with a massive incisional hernia and a stoma, and he was still leaking urine from his rectum. The family say at one of the operations, the surgeon did remove the branch that had broken off inside him. And we're faced with this boy, this young teenager. And I guess the question is, what is it that we should do for this person? As Christians faced with this, what is it that we should do? I don't know whether, there's no wrong answers to this. So this isn't, I'm not trying to catch anyone out or, but just if you have an idea, I don't mean particularly we should do this kind of operation or something like that. I'm not asking a technical question, but how should we respond as Christians to this scenario? What do people think?
First thing that strikes me as a doctor is just gather as much information as possible. So what data have we got out there? Are there any operation records, or have you had any scans in other places, or just anything that will inform us better? Very, very helpful.
And I think what we are wired to do as doctors, which is normal and is exactly what what I did in this situation, is to think, okay, so how do we fix this problem? Because the problem is he's leaking urine and he's got a massive incisional hernia, and he doesn't want those things. He wants to be able to play football for Madagascar. So how are we gonna put that right? And And so I think that what we did do then is ask some more questions, as Sarah has suggested, but questions about him and about his background. And what the story that came out is that when he was born, his parents were rice and cattle farmers, so doing quite well for themselves in Madagascar, in sort of village Malagasy terms. And one night, Dahalu, which are like a cross between mafia and kind of cattle rustlers, stole all of their cattle, and their livelihood was completely ruined. They had no help from law enforcement or anything like that. They just lost everything, and they had to become charcoal burners. And charcoal burning is really the occupation of the very poor in Madagascar. And then a few years ago, this little boy's mum became pregnant, but she became sick while she was pregnant. And because they were so poor, her husband couldn't care for her. And so they took this little boy out of school at the age of 10 in order to care for his pregnant mother. And he never went back. And then earlier this year, he was helping his parents prepare the wood for charcoal burning, and he sat down on the log, and this is how this whole story started. And I think the thing that I really wanted to highlight about that is it leaves you feeling pretty powerless in a sense, because you realize that for this boy, just sorting out his fistula doesn't really help him with many of the problems that he's facing in life. There's a helpful definition of health, which was from the WHO right back in 1948, which is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And so we can perhaps help with the physical well-being, but what about the mental and social well-being? How are we going to help with, for example, education? How are we going to help with the fact that there's no security where he is, that people can just take all your cattle and there's nothing that's going to be done about it? How can we help with improving property rights and rule of law, and removing the corruption that's in all of those things? And I think it's interesting just to imagine for a moment how you would act if you had had 2 failed operations and be left with a stoma and a massive incisional hernia, and you were still leaking urine. You wouldn't just wait passively hoping for something to happen. You wouldn't want to just be reliant on the benevolence of some foreigner who says, I can sort you out, and gives you free treatment. That's so far from our self-image. We are individuals who can act in the world for ourselves. And I think it's helpful just to remember that we're all created in God's image. And being created in God's image, we're people who are supposed to act in the world for God. God gave us this cultural mandate to fill the earth, to subdue it, to rule over the creatures of the sea, and to have dominion over his creation. God gave us power to act in the world for good. And we didn't, as a race, we didn't do that. We sinned, and after the fall, we're experiencing the consequences of that. But part of what God wants for this little boy is not just that we see him as someone who is worthy of our mercy, but that we see him as someone who is created in God's image and has the capacity to be like us, someone who thinks about what his life calling might be, or who is able to act in the world with creativity and power to do good for other people, as we are able to. And so to do that, we need to think beyond just helping the one patient in front of us. Not that there's anything wrong with just helping the person right in front of us, but if we want to help more deeply, we need to think beyond that. And we need to think about development. That's what we're talking about. And this guy, Amartya Sen, who won a Nobel Prize for economics and wrote this book, Development as Freedom. Talked about human development being about having the freedoms to lead the kind of lives that we have reason to value. So what can we do to help someone like this little 13-year-old boy live the kind of life that we have reason to value? Well, that's just a much more complicated question than, you know, whether we do a one-stage fistula repair and closes stoma, or whether we do that over 2 operations, or, you know, it's a different challenge altogether. If actually our goal is to help him and to help many like him flourish as human beings created in God's image, wow, it's a different challenge. And so that question is, what should we do for him? What should we do for him? And this is where my desire to invest in people comes from. Because we can turn up as Westerners in places like this incredibly poor part of the world. We can act almost like magicians, walking around going, poof, put a building there, and, you know, do another project over here. We can just sort of make stuff happen. And although God did create the world by just speaking and making stuff happen, he then put us in the world as his representatives to live in his image like little gods, in that sense, as in those who have power to act in the world for good, those who are given by him dominion, and who are supposed to rule and fill and subdue the earth. And so, in fact, wouldn't a better use of our power, so to speak, what the resources that we have available to us as Westerners coming to this kind of situation, not to be just to walk around doing stuff ourselves, but to be to invest in others and help them to fulfill the potential that they have as image bearers, to be in their own right people who are acting in the world for the good of others in a way that brings great glory to God. In order to do that, of course, they need to know the God that they are created in the image of. And so we want to be sharing the gospel with these people. But they also need us to help create environments in which they can flourish. And so that is where, for me, Pax comes in. We are trying to help young men and women, by God's grace, to develop into the kind of people who can make a real difference in their country. We don't want to just do that all ourselves, fun as that might be. We want to help these guys to become surgeons, to become disciples of Jesus, but also potentially to become future leaders in their own communities. A place like Madagascar is still a place where to be a doctor is a hugely respected thing. I think it used to be the case in the UK, but it's a long time ago. You know, they naturally will have positions of leadership within their community because of their role. Add on to that they're a surgeon, which for whatever reason in this context is also a hugely respected thing. And they are potentially people who could have a real impact for good. And so that is why we want to invest in these people. As we come to a close, I wanted to share this video, which is only about 4 minutes long. So hopefully we're going to overrun by a few minutes, but it won't only be by about 3 minutes. This is the story of Tefi, who is that young doctor who I said when we first arrived in Mandritsara was kind of working alongside me, just kind of helping me as a surgeon, and I was showing him bits and pieces. And he then became our first PAX resident. And he, like the little boy that I just shared the story of, grew up as a rice farmer, living, you know, alongside his livestock, farming the fields every day. He'll tell you a little bit about that in his story. But hopefully you can see that not just through the work of Pax, I don't want to claim it all for us, but through the investment of people in his life, he's now being prepared, God willing, to become someone of great influence in his community, who is a wonderful, godly young man, a well-trained surgeon. He's now in his 3rd year. He's extremely gifted surgically, who could perhaps make a big difference in this country for the cause of the gospel and for the good of the people here. So let me just play that that video if I can get it to start now.
Quand l'inscription à l'université, à la faculté de médecine s'ouvrait, quelqu'un est venu et m'a regardé de la tête aux pieds et il m'a vu pauvre et il m'a dit le cursus médical n'est pas fait pour une personne comme toi. Si j'étais à ta place, j'abandonne. Je remercie Dieu parce que c'était pas vrai ce qu'il a dit. Mais comme j'avais toujours eu depuis mon enfance, c'est de réaliser ce rêve d'aider les pauvres et les gens en besoin. Quand j'étais encore petit, la vie était, je dirais, dure. Il y a une expression, ça veut dire ce qu'on va manger aujourd'hui, on va le chercher aujourd'hui. Pour nous, c'est plus que ça. Ce qu'on va manger aujourd'hui, on va le chercher demain. Quand j'étais petit et j'étais malade presque tous les jours, on allait chez une infirmière. Elle a beaucoup de compréhension pour ma famille. Ça m'a inspiré de devenir comme elle, comme telle personne qui a vraiment le cœur pour les gens pauvres et pour les gens en besoin. Quand j'ai réussi mon baccalauréat, mon cousin, et je t'encourage de continuer ce rêve de devenir médecin. À la fin du cursus universitaire, le docteur Schleb nous a expliqué de long l'âge, l'hôpital Vauvan-Mafal, la mission, la vision. Ce qui a attiré mon attention la première fois, c'est le fait que le but, c'est d'évangéliser. Et je voudrais impliquer dans cette mission d'évangélisation. L'hôpital Vauvan-Mafal m'a appelé que c'était positif. Il y avait d'autres offres à Tana, plus de salaire, mais j'ai décidé de rester ici à l'hôpital Vauban-Mafal parce que je pense que l'argent n'est pas le premier motif de travail, parce que si je vais quitter ici, tout le rêve depuis mon enfance vont être foutus. Maintenant, je suis la formation chirurgicale avec Pax, que c'est à la fois évangélisation, mais aussi chirurgie. Je voyais l'objectif de Pax et je voyais aussi mes rêves. Cette Pax va être une partie de ce que Dieu va faire dans ma vie. Ça, c'est l'endroit idéal que Dieu a préparé pour réaliser mes rêves. On va chez ceux qui sont en besoin et on les soigne avec de la compassion, comme l'infirmière m'a traité. Je pense que en imitant ce que cette infirmière faisait, si tous les chrétiens faisaient les mêmes choses, ça va changer le monde.
I think you can imagine that it's a real joy to be able to work with someone like Tefi, to be able to in little ways invest in his life and in helping him to grow spiritually as a person, as a surgeon. And one thing he said to me, in fact, there were some people visiting the hospital, and they said to him, "So what are you going to do when you finish surgical training?" And I was like, "Oh, I want to listen to this because I wonder what he's going to say." And he said, "Well, first of all, I want to become a member of the faculty, which means like the teachers. So I want to give back to the next generation, so they can also benefit from the training that I've received. So I want to train others, which is very exciting." But then he said, and then when I'm older, I want to go and build a hospital in my own town because they need surgeons there. And yeah, it's just exciting to see that God willing, one day he might be used, of course, in lots of small ways in everyday life, but also in these big things of potentially training other surgeons to be kind of mission-minded Christian surgeons for Madagascar, but also going and starting a new work in a place where both the gospel and surgical care are so desperately needed. So are there any questions? I know we're probably at the end of our time. Do feel free, though, to pipe in with questions. Someone's got their hand up. Is it Jodie, I think, got your hand up?
Yeah, just wondering, are you still maintaining a license to practice in the UK?
Yeah, good question. So no, I'm not maintaining a license to practice in the UK because I still have my registration in the UK. If you want to maintain a license to practice in the UK, you need to be practicing in the UK because you need to be evaluated on UK practice. So I can't be evaluated on my practice in Madagascar for maintaining a UK license to practice. So if I wanted to maintain it, that would mean coming home to the UK once a year, probably, realistically, finding somewhere that wanted to employ me as a surgeon for long enough that someone felt they could evaluate me. And that is all just a whole load of stress that I really don't need. And I don't know that it's going to be easy if ever and whenever we decide to go back to the UK. But I understand that it should be possible to pick up your license to practice if you've got no issues with your regulating body in the country that you've been practicing in, and you follow the right procedure, then you should be able to pick up your license to practice again. It's another question, obviously, whether or not someone would want to give me a job. That's for each employer to decide whether they want someone who's been working in Africa for the last however many years. But yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, if we come to it. So
Okay. And I thank you. I was just also wondering briefly how you school your children.
Yeah, so that's a really if we've got another hour and a half, I'll talk to you about schooling the children. But we homeschool and we put our children in the local school. We're not so the local school is French speaking. It's great for socialization. They do learn French. They learn some maths there as well, which is helpful. But we're not kind of counting on it to be a major source of their education. And so in the afternoons, my wife homeschools them. We're not homeschoolers by kind of conviction, but as we experience it, I think we've just become more and more excited by the opportunities that it provides us. It really helps to be much more engaged than I imagine you might be in your child's education, and in them kind of growing and informing them into the kind of person that we're hoping that they might become. It's not easy. It involves arguments and tantrums and all that, but it has some real benefits that we're beginning to see and hope we'll continue to see in the future.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for all your input there. That was really really encouraging, inspiring stories that you were sharing there, and thanks for the work you've done into preparing for the session today. I just wanted to invite those who are available to join us in July 13th down in London. We've got a CMF Day, Journeying into Global Health and Mission. As part of that, we've got a mission fair in the afternoon, and I think we're planning to have representation from the Friends of Manjit Sara Trust at that mission fair. So it'll be an encouraging time just meeting with other healthcare workers in the UK with a passion for mission and learning from each other, being together. This is the last of this series of global modules, so thanks for participating. We are hoping to continue these going forward, so do get in touch if there's other topics that you'd like to learn about. So thanks all for your participation. God bless, and keep in touch.